I am Christy Rivers. I teach 3rd and 4th grade at Faith Plano. I did my undergrad and secondary ed English. My grad school, I went to Ohio State and did literature and rhetoric. The Ohio State. We like to capitalize our article adjectives. But actually, the line on my resume that I think is most relevant to today's talk is actually from earlier. I hold a black belt in full contact karate. And I know that doesn't sound like it has anything to do with fairy tales, but you're going to have to stick with me for just a minute. Okay, so I trained on the Olympic Taekwondo circuit for a while. I had a semi-professional kickboxing career until my mom saw me knock a girl out, and then I wasn't allowed to do that anymore. This is all before college, and it's amazing I made it through college. But my first teaching job was with karate. I was hired at 16 to teach children's karate classes and women's self-defense classes. Now, with the women's self-defense classes, my instructor and I would go into these like sororities, book clubs, church groups, and we would teach a night of self-defense, okay? So you can't teach a lot of kicking and punching in 3 hours, but you can teach people how to think about it differently. So there were 2 things that we wanted the participants to take away. The first was an awareness, right? Seeing danger coming. And I'm gonna be real honest with you. I was not that nervous when I was 16. I'm terrified today. Like, you guys are all much older than my usual audience. I could say anything, and they're just like, okay. So we taught them awareness, and then the other thing we wanted to teach them was how they viewed themselves in relation to that danger, okay? A mindset thing. So we would have them do a visualization exercise. And guess what? You're gonna do a visualization exercise, okay? So I'm gonna have you close your eyes, and I promise I won't punch you. I promise. I know, Mr. Han. So I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to imagine the following scenario, okay? And the more you can use your imagination, get all your senses involved, the better. All right, it's late at night. You are in an unfamiliar city, and you're trying to get from the restaurant to your car, okay? It's about 3 blocks. You look at your phone, it's almost dead. You've got like 4% battery. And you're like, okay, I'll go quickly and I'll make it there. And you're nervous because this isn't the best choice that you've made, but you need to get to your car, okay? So you step out into the city, and it has that city smell of, old garbage and diesel fuel. And you're walking, it's late, and it's silent. As you walk, you start to hear an echo to your footsteps, and you realize that there's a second set of footsteps. And you think, maybe it's just somebody else like me walking to their car, and you just pick up the pace a little bit and keep walking. You hear the footsteps gaining closer and closer and closer. You look over your shoulder, there's a dark, very large figure not too far back. Your pulse starts racing, shaking a little bit, you move faster, okay? Pretty soon you're jogging and he's matching your pace. And you come to the realization that you're not going to make it to your car before he makes it to you. Your phone's dead, you can't call for help. You have nothing on you but a set of keys. And so you just sprint. And here he comes after you. You hear the thud of his footsteps, and pretty soon he reaches out and grabs the back of your neck. Open your eyes. How do you feel? Freaked out, right? Panic, terror, fear, right? Has anyone ever experienced that tunnel vision you get from fear, where you can't see anything, you can't think straight, you can't talk, right? Most people, when they get grabbed or attacked, They immediately shrink in, and they can't do anything. Close your eyes again. Same scenario. This time you have someone with you. I want you to visualize this person. This person is someone that you love, but someone who's not as strong as you are. Maybe it's a child, a student, a friend, an elderly parent or grandparent. There's someone else with you. Maybe it's your wife, your sister, somebody else. Picture that person in your head. The two of you are together. You're running to the car. Okay? You realize this person is going to catch you. The only person to defend the person you love is you. How do you feel now? You can open your eyes. How does that change it for you? Yeah.
You stop thinking about yourself and you feel this huge urge to make sure that your other person is safe.
Right. People, when we would talk to women, these women who could never imagine themselves winning a fight, right, or fighting off an attacker, suddenly fight like a Spartan in Thermopylae. Okay? Suddenly they're savage. They are going to, if it takes their own life, they're going to do this. Okay? So the first scenario, you're a victim, right? Victims are weak. Victims are scared. Victims get hurt. Okay? In the second scenario, you're the hero. Heroes are strong. Heroes are brave. Heroes are courageous. You get a whole nother surge of adrenaline that you didn't have the first time, right? This is why we teach fairy tales in a classical Lutheran school. This mindset shift, right? Because fairy tales allow students to not be the victim, but to see themselves as the hero. If you look at the handout in front of you, the first quote by C.S. Lewis, when it says a classical Lutheran education should include fairy tales at all grade levels because the world is evil and fairy tales prepare children to face evil courageously. The first quote actually hangs on my wall at school next to a picture of St. George killing the dragon. It says, "Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you're making their destiny not brighter, but darker." Chesterton, who later the quote gets changed as it's requoted by Neil Gaiman, I think. Chesterton says, "Fairy tales, then, are not responsible for producing in children fear or any of the shapes of fear. Fairy tales do not give the child the idea of the ugly or the evil of the ugly. That's in the child already because it's in the world already. Fairy tales do not give the child his first idea of bogey. The fairy tale gives the child his first clear idea of the possible defeat of bogey. The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he had an imagination." Right, Lucy? I'm with you. What the fairy tale provides for him is a St. George to kill the dragon, right? Fairy tales are not the weapons of spiritual warfare, right? That's not what I'm arguing at all. They're the courage to pick up the weapons, right? Alistair MacIntyre, who's quoted in Gregorian, and I didn't go back and find the original quote, I apologize. It says, "If you deprive children of stories, you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions and their words." And again, Lewis says, "And I think it possible that by confining your children to blameless stories of child life, progressive ones, in which nothing at all alarming ever happens, you would fail to banish terrors and would succeed in banishing all that can ennoble them or make them endurable." All right. So we need fairy tales because fairy tales give us a model of how to face evil courageously, because fairy tales present the good, beautiful, and true in a meaningful way. And then finally, because limiting the teaching of fairy tales to just small children is progressive. We need to teach them at every grade level, pre-K all the way up through college, all right? So how many of you have read Gregorian's book on the moral imagination? Nobody? Okay, go home and read the book. It's fantastic. Go home and read the book. He says, mere instruction in morality is not sufficient to nurture the virtues, right? Just telling kids, you need to be good, right? You create, says it might even backfire instead of compelling vision of goodness. Instead, a compelling vision of the goodness itself needs to be presented in a way that is attractive and stirs the imagination. Instead of just telling kids to be good, we need to show them what goodness looks like in a way that they can connect to. Fairy tales resonate with the deepest qualities of humanness, freedom, and the moral imagination. Right, he also says that they say plainly that virtue and vice are opposites and not just by matters of degree. Right? That we need to really kind of give students this very clear picture of what goodness is, and they do that in a meaningful way. And then Lewis and Tolkien have a lot to say about fairy tales not being just for children. Since they both wrote fairy tales, which they considered to be their best works, they were a little sensitive on the topic. Tolkien talks about how fairy tales are the furniture that have gone out of fashion and been stuck up in the nursery because nobody wants to look at it anymore. We've kind of said, oh yes, we've grown out of those and shoved them in the closet. He says, if a fairy tale is the kind worth reading at all, it is worthy to be written for and read by adults. And then C.S. Lewis says, no book is really worth reading at the age of 10, which is not equally and often far more worth reading at the age of 50, except, of course, books of information. He had a photographic memory, so he only had to read things once. I read them multiple times. The only imaginative work that we ought to grow out of are those which we would have been better off not to have read at all. And both of them would have hated Disney and thought they murdered all fairy tales. They're not wrong. So on the second page, right, what do I mean by fairy tale? I know I'm getting this backwards because I always tell my students they have to define their terms first, and I decided not to. Whoops, there goes my coffee. Also, an important part of teaching. So how many of you have read On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien? Okay, this is one that I would say needs to be taught at the high school level. It's excellent for introducing this kind of writing, and I would strongly encourage you to read it with upper level, like 8th and up. He says that a fairy story is not one about little magical Tinkerbells, right? He gets very upset about the diminutive size. Gulliver's Travel, not a fairy tale, just because the people are tiny. But he says that a fairy story is one that touches on or uses fairy, capital F-A-E-R-I-E, which itself may be perhaps most nearly to be translated by magic. Okay, so you know it's a fairy tale when it's been touched by fairy. He says King Arthur is the king of fairy, right? He was a real king. He got thrown in the cauldron of story and came out the king of fairy. So he considers like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to fit into the realm of fairy tale. An essential power of fairy, he says in the next quote, is thus the power of making immediately effective by the will the visions of fantasy. He says that they include recovery, escape, consolation, and eucatastrophe, right? Which is a sudden miraculous grace. It's this thing that should not have happened, but it suddenly happens and everything again. And it's not that you expect it to happen, but it happens anyway, right? And it's necessary for this twist in the story. Not about fairies, not dream stories, not beast fables. He goes through what it isn't. And it can never satirize the magic itself, right? You can't make fun of the magic. The magic is serious because the world has to operate, this fantasy world has to operate within its own rules. You can't break the rules of that world, even though they break the rules of ours, right? He says they're not primarily concerned with possibility, desire, right? There's something about a good fairy tale that makes you want to participate within that world, right? That draws you into it. That's the enchantment of the story, is that you become drawn into the story. They awaken desire, satisfy it, while often whetting it unbearably, then they succeed. And I have a 9-year-old who's recently discovered The Lord of the Rings, and he thinks he's Gollum. He was really unhappy when I wouldn't let him wear just for Halloween. But he has this incredible, insatiable desire to be part of that world, right? He's fascinated by that world and he's drawn into it. And that's the power that Tolkien talks about, is that these stories draw us in and make us want to be a part of that. And part of that is the good and the beautiful and the true that we pull from those stories. Common characteristics of fairy tales. When I ask my third graders, well, what does a fairy tale have? They always say, once upon a time, right? And happily ever after. That's our eucatastrophe, right? That's the sudden grace that just happens that allows for that happily ever after. We have a good versus evil that's clear. We often have occurrences in groups of 3s, right? And we have enchantment, magical creatures, all of this that functions within those rules of literary belief. So not everything in like the Brothers Grimm, Tolkien would not have included everything in there as a fairy tale, right? He says some of those are beast fables because they're all about animals, or they don't all quite fit his definition, but I really like his definition for the purposes of classical Lutheran education. So, and I don't think some of those stories are necessarily not worth teaching, but take that definition for what it is. Okay, Tolkien knew way more than me. The next point, classical fairy tales teach heroic virtue and develop moral imagination. And this is where we get into the Grorian, right? He argues that that the great fairy tales and fantasy stories capture the meaning of morality through vivid depictions of the struggle between good and evil, where characters must make difficult choices between right and wrong, or heroes and villains contest the very fate of imaginary worlds, right? So this heroic virtue is this willingness and desire to do what is good and right, even at great personal cost, right? It's that flippant mindset where you switch from being the victim and being scared to being heroic and brave, right? It gives the student that ability to say, when trial and evil comes, because let's face it, anyone here not experienced evil yet? Okay, so it happens, right? Evil, wicked things happen in our worlds, in our lives, and having that courage to say, okay, I'm going to deal with this even if it's not what I want, right? It gives the student that catalyst for that. An example, right? We read Pinocchio in 3rd grade. You guys read Pinocchio? If you don't read Pinocchio, add that one to the curriculum. It's one of my favorites. We read Pinocchio, and I have this student who struggled with lying all year. Right? And we all know Pinocchio's nose grows, right? Even if you haven't read the original Italian one. And we don't read it in Italian, but we did watch it in Italian. The blue fairy comes and says, well, there's 2 kinds of lies. There's the lies that make you look foolish, and there's the lies that make you shrink. They make you look small, right? And so when I caught the student lying, I said, okay, guess what? You get to write about this. Is this a lie that makes you look foolish or a lie that makes you look small? And he was like, it was a great moment. And he didn't lie to me after that. But it's true. It gives you these opportunities to talk about these things that are going to come up. I read Sarah Clarkson's Caught Up in a Story, Fostering a Story Life of Great Books and Imagination for Your Children. Have anyone read that one? It's not specifically about fairy tales, but kind of great literature in general. And it's a quick read. She goes back and quotes a lot of these same people. But she says, heroism comes from the perception of what is good, right, and beautiful, and a will to claim and defend it, right? To realize that we are part of a greater story, right? And that we can enter into that conversation. And then moral imagination is really what Gregorian focuses on, right? He says it's the very process by which the self makes metaphors out of images given by experience and then employs these metaphors to find and suppose moral correspondences in experience, right? And I don't think any kid is like, I'm going to think about making some metaphors out of this. But we do this automatically, right? When we know the stories, we automatically put ourselves in as protagonists. And this is a very normal human behavior where we automatically think we are the hero of every story. More of a supporting cast person, which is why this is a little weird. But they do. They automatically see themselves as protagonists, and it's this idea that these experiences that they experience through literature, they draw on these as they come to actual dilemmas. And G.K. Chesterton says, I'm concerned with a certain way of looking at life which was created in me by the fairy tales, but has since been meekly ratified by mere facts. If you haven't read Tremendous Trifles, he's a character. I like Chesterton. Very sarcastic. So that's kind of a really quick summary of all of that. We'll stop there before we talk about how to teach tales, authors, collectors. We'll stop for a moment for thoughts and questions so I can drink coffee. Stephanie.
Does fiction fall into this fairy tale category?
For Tolkien? Often, yes.
But in general, science fiction?
He classifies it as fantasy, but I think he would have counted, C.S. Lewis's trilogy as fantasy. I don't know that all science fiction would work. I don't know that it would work if it was just in the future. He talks a lot about how, he writes to Lewis when Lewis is still in his agnostic phase. He writes and says, the right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. So in other words, he spends a lot of this time talking about how we're sub-creators and how fantasy is actually, he calls it a human right, which in this day and age, I think is some loaded language, but he didn't write in the 21st century. But he talks about how we're sub-creators and how because we are in the image of the Creator who created the world with words, we've been given this kind of shadow creative power where we create worlds with words, and that's just a natural part of being created by a God who values language, right? That he gave us this gift of creation, and we are sub-creators, and we create worlds, and in these worlds, we should have good versus evil, and every story, right, is in some way a shadow of the story, and every hero is in many ways a shadow of the hero, right, who saved us. And so, this is why modernist and postmodernist literature wants to get rid of the hero and have the anti-hero and all of that. It's all It's not on accident. But I don't know if he would have counted all science fiction or just science fiction that seems to be touched by some element of the magical. I think he'd be more discerning, but yeah. Erica.
Do you find that fairy tales like C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia that are apparently talking about and connecting to the story are even of a either higher or more important value? Or do you see kind of all that fit this kind of definition of fairy tales just for the virtues that come with it kind of equal?
I think there's absolutely a continuum of more or less valuable. I mean, and some of that is, some of them I get really excited about. I'm like, this is important, kids. And they're like, okay. It's the glory of teaching third grade. Taught high school, and they don't follow you like that. You teach college, and they'll look at you like, why am I here? But yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely a continuum. I think some stories are more useful in this way. Did that answer your question, or did I get lost? Okay. Yes.
Does the good always win in a fairy tale?
It doesn't always. Okay. Sometimes the good suffers greatly or even dies. But that's not necessarily wrong, right? Because there's usually a eucatastrophe where, the main character may have sacrificed themselves, but then they come back to life, that sort of thing. But I think you could have a fairy tale where evil thinks it wins, but it doesn't. I mean, look at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? You have the whole, Aslan dies, but the story's not done. So, yeah, I think you could have that. I don't think you could have one where evil wins. That's not true to the story, right? Any other questions, thoughts, jokes, limericks? Yes?
What's your favorite fairy tale?
I really like, anything by Lewis and Tolkien, I really love. But in terms of classical fairy tales, I really like teaching Pinocchio. I also really love George MacDonald. I love teaching The Princess and the Goblin. We just added that one this year, and it was one of my favorites. If you look at that last page, right, there's a list of authors and collectors, and those are in chronological order from around Europe. Charles Perrault is French. We got the Grimm brothers that are German. Hans Christian Andersen. Carlo Collodi is Pinocchio. George MacDonald has some great stuff that would be fantastic for high school. I think that he should be read more. Tolkien had some criticism of Andrew Lang's book, The Blue Fairy Book, but that's one that has some good stuff in it, and all of the fairy books. You just kind of got to pick and choose a little bit. Oscar Wilde would be good for high school, his collection of fairy tales, and then of course C.S. Lewis and Tolkien consider themselves in that realm too. I think the most important thing when you're teaching fairy tales is to let the fairy tales do what they do, right? Fairy tales have this level of enchantment that any good literature has to some degree, but I think it's important to let the fairy tale do its magic, to not interrupt the story, right? Lewis spends a lot of time talking about the story and how important the story is, that it's not the character-driven narrative, but it's the story-driven. And I think it's important to let that happen. So things like pre-teaching concepts, words that wouldn't necessarily be familiar to students, and so that when you read the story the first time through, you can really just read it and enjoy it and let them love it, right? Because that's how we came to love books, right? Is that somebody read us a story, or we read a story and kind of got immersed in that world. So you may need to read the story multiple times, especially if it's a short one. You can read it multiple times so that you can take all of those things from it. But before you start dissecting it, let the story stand on its own, right? We spend a lot of time retelling fairy tales. So they read it, but then in 3rd and 4th grade, we start writing them, right? And they write the fairy tale that we just read in their own words. I have this little booklet that I found somewhere online, Imitation Writing Fairy Tales, and it's hard to find, but if you can find a copy of it, that's what he does, is that he has them read the tale and then retell the tale, right? And we do this sometimes with, I let them tell it, make a play out of it, write a comic strip, anything that involves them retelling the story. Letting little kids act out the story, they love that, right, Michelle? She's our preschool teacher. They love acting it out. Give them costumes. They always want to. I have a couple plastic swords. Pastor. And they love getting to hold the sword. When you're the hero, you get to hold the sword. And that's kind of the ultimate. But they love that kind of acting it out. And high schoolers like this too, okay? They may not say they do. Well, middle schoolers are the ones that are like, I'm so embarrassed. High schoolers kind of re-embrace this. They like acting it out, and they like getting to do this as well. So don't just save this for the preschoolers. High schoolers like this too. When you're talking about it, focus on those key moments of change, right? When a decision is made, when something flips, right? Find the eucatastrophe in the story. Where does that change happen, where it goes from being a story about a problem to the story about a solution? And even the youngest kids can do this. They know when the story changed. They know when this eucatastrophe happens, even if they have no idea what that word is. So ask about those moments and let them kind of guide the story. Look for those moments where things happen in 3, where magic enters the story, those sorts of things. Choose translations that are rich in language. I mean, a lot of these were written in French or German or Italian. Pick a translation where the words are beautiful, maybe the illustrations are beautiful, especially with the little kids. Don't just pick any translation of Grimm. Some of them are kind of lame. Pick one with good vocabulary that really is going to enrich that part of the story. Fairy tales are great for high school students, middle school students learning to write a thesis-driven essay. Right? So when they're writing an analytical paper, right, you can use kind of this thesis formula of the story seems to be about this thing, but it's really about something completely different, right? And students like finding these moments. For example, Tolkien talks about how the Frog King is not about marrying frogs, okay? It's not about frogs at all. It's actually about keeping your word no matter what the consequences will be, right? That always doing that, even when it's going to not seem to work out so well for you. And so those sorts of starting them out on kind of literary analysis in that way is a nice, easy way to ease them into it, because fairy tales, that's what they are. They seem to be about something else, but that's not the point, right? The point is always something connected to good and evil, right and wrong, ugly and beautiful, right? That juxtaposition is the key, the important part of the fairy tale. I have a list of kind of my favorite references, and then there's a couple at the bottom there that I just want to also touch on. And I've got, I also read Kirkpatrick and Wolf's Books That Build Character. It kind of just is a list of good books, not just fairy tales, but kind of books that they think are important. It was interesting. Brutal Bettelheim's The Use of Enchantment is kind of the more foundational work on theory and fairy tales. Everyone quotes Bettelheim at some point. He acknowledges that fairy tales are far more meaningful if you're religious than if you're not. Duh. But if you're feeling like, getting into some academic endeavor, he'd probably want to read. I included Joan Gould's. I wouldn't necessarily run out and buy her book, okay? But the Spinning Straw into Gold, she does a good job of summarizing the feminist use of fairy tales. And I'll be really honest, I did not read a fairy tale in school until I was in graduate school in a feminist studies class. My professor was a former president of NOW, the National Organization of Women, and she hated me because I wore a crucifix to class. So it was not a good semester. But she made us read fairy tales, and the only thing she hated as much as my crucifix was a fairy tale, which made me think, maybe I need to read more fairy tales, because if she hated them, then I usually liked it. We were kind of worked that way. But the feminists do. They like to deconstruct fairy tales and talk about the patriarchy and blah, blah, blah. And it really goes back to what Tolkien was saying, is that all of these stories reflect the story. And the world hates the story, right? So that's another good reason for us to teach them if the world hates them so much. Are there any more questions? Uh-oh. All right. Here, you stand up here. Okay.
Great presentation, great topic. I just want to say one reason some conservative Christians don't teach fairy tales is because, they're scary.
Yeah.
They're scary. Bruno Bettelheim is really good in addressing that, because he shows that fairy tales bring up what children, in fact, are already terrified of. For example, Hansel and Gretel. What if my parents can't take care of me? I mean, kids really do think that way. What would that? And it takes these deep, scary things in a child's psychology and shows that the child can get through that. That if the very worst happens, Hansel and Gretel story tells you, you'll win.
Yeah. Which is
You'll
what
get through.
Chesterton and Lewis were saying too, that kids already know evil. They're sinners, right? We're good at evil, but goodness doesn't come naturally. Yes?
What do we do with when magic is used more in a either satanic or a black art way in literature, or when we have writers who are anti-Christian using magic to draw children into books?
That's a complicated question, and I have a feeling you and I are going to go out to dinner sometime and have that discussion. I will tell you that my personal philosophy is that I do not believe in banning any book. I do believe in waiting. That not every child is ready for every book at a certain time, all right? But like, I let my kids read Harry Potter. Confession time. I started teaching at the time when Harry Potter was getting banned in Christian schools, and I think that one, I think Tolkien would defend it as good and evil, and so I don't take that one. But there are some others that are written against Christianity as much as Lewis wrote for Christianity, right? And those are not worth our time because there's so many books that are. So that's my quick answer, is that any book that fits this definition where good and evil fight, and good is clearly good, right? That there's not this, Grendel versus Beowulf thing, Grendel's only the hero. There's a time and place for teaching apologetics, but it's not third grade like that. So yeah, I think that there's so many wonderful books that some of them we just don't bother with. So yeah.
I know you spoke a little bit about picking a vocabulary-rich translation, but what about like an abridged version where it's written at a lower grade level for a younger kid?
Well, do you still pick
Does
one
that have a
that
place?
fits?
Yeah, I mean, you still pick one that is your grade level appropriate. I mean, like Michelle behind you, she teaches preschool and downstairs right underneath me and has to listen to me stomping around all day. And she and I would probably pick different translations because the vocabulary of her kids is different than the vocabulary of mine, right? And we both want to pick something that is going to challenge our students, but still draw them in to the point where they understand the story and they love it, right? We don't want to frustrate them. So I would pick a different version of Pinocchio for preschool than I would for third grade. And I might even pick a different version for high school because you want that rich language, but you don't want to frustrate your kids either.
So like for middle school ages where you're kind of in that in between, do you think it would be appropriate to read two different versions? Read one and then read something that's harder so they...
Well, and if, like Pastor Cholak said, right, you can read at a lower level than you can listen, right? And so sometimes when you're reading it aloud to them, you can read a harder version than when if you're leaving them alone to read it. So that's something else to take into account. Like I don't leave my third graders to read The Princess and the Goblin alone because they have to get used to the language of it. That's when I read to them for the most part, but then they work with it on their own. So it really just depends on who your kids are and what they're ready for. And if it seems like it's too hard for them, read it to them and talk about it instead of abandoning. Yeah.
Yeah, could you tell us just what some of the fairy stories are that you use in your teaching? You've done that some, and we think of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, mentioned George MacDonald, which is really very, very helpful, another literary person. What about the traditional ones? You mentioned the Frog King. What are some others? Snow White.
My Grimm's fairy tales with me. We do Ashpuddle, which is Cinderella. And my kids love that one because the sisters cut parts of their feet off.
Exactly. The children, Bella makes that same point. The kids love the violence in it. So a lot of the ones that they get, the excavated, the short, they take all the fun parts out of it.
Yeah.
They clean it up. Go ahead.
My kids told me last year that the theme for our study of literature was books Disney had ruined. Because they're like, oh, we have to read this, and then we read it, and they're like, that was so much better than the movie. Bethany, what did we read in third grade? What else do we read? I pick and choose. I'll be honest, okay? I'm a little ADD. And yeah, we read the Odyssey. I change out fairy tales every year as I read one that I get more excited about or less excited. You're welcome to email me. I can tell you what I taught last year when I go look at my list. Have it written down somewhere. But yeah, I don't do straight through Grimm's or straight through Hans Christian Andersen. Gregorian does have a good ones that he picks. I go back and forth on The Little Mermaid. I think that'd be a good one for high school. I think that my students kind of go, that's just bad theology, and we kind of go, yeah, okay, move on. I don't really know what to do with that one yet. They love some of the, some of the Hans Christian Andersen ones they really love, and some of them they're like, what is this? Like when the tin soldier melts, they're like, that was garbage. They don't like that. They want the happily ever after. So they will fight with me and say, that one was not a fairy tale. And then after we read all of those, then I read Lewis with them and I say, okay, was this a fairy tale? And then they argue with me about whether or not it was. And third graders actually get quite worked up about literary criticism. So they have strong feelings on this. Yeah.
Maybe this is more for the older ones also, but is there a place for creative writing in teaching fairy tales?
Especially if you're using the Tolkien, he says that naturally flows out of that. Once you've read some of this, you have to create your own world, right? That's your kind of natural God-given role as sub-creator, that you're going to just start creating fantasy worlds. And third grade fantasy worlds are they're not that great. But you got to start somewhere. And they do like doing it. The high schoolers definitely should be doing it.
Do you notice big differences in how girls and boys react to the fairy tales, and like do girls also see themselves as the heroes or more as the princesses? Do boys and girls all like the feet being cut off?
Most of my third grade girls are still in that age where they still play on the playground with the boys, and they are like, ew, princesses, bleh. And then you get a little older and they're like, they I don't know, there's this weird age where it's like, princesses, bleh. And there's always a couple that are like, it's so beautiful. But most of them are like more interested in cutting off feet in third grade. It changes a little in middle school. But I think that it's universal. I think that fairy tales aren't necessarily more. I mean, when you tell third grade boys, we're going to read fairy tales, they go, but then somebody gets something stabbed and they're happy.
Yeah, a lot of fairy tales, if you want a girl, girls are usually the main characters in most of the classic fairy tales. Think Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, just go on. And it gets a female point of view. The female is the hero. There may be a prince in it, but the point of view is the girl. And Household Gretel is the one that pushes this witch into the oven. And she's the real leader in that little situation. And
Yeah. Did you have something, Pastor Trolley?
Well, I was just going to say that in reading aloud, we were seeing that there's like a listening vocabulary pool that then overflows into your spelling and your writing and your reading pools, and those listening experiences flow over in your writing, your creative writing, and as they read more of these, they're going to get more stuff in their tool belt, so to speak, to write with, to speak.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for coming. My email is on the sheet if you have any questions, critiques, anything like that. I'm happy to talk about that further. If anyone needs some classroom management strategies, kickboxing lessons later.